Racist billionaire accuses black waitress of stealing. His regret when he finds the truth. What if you were falsely accused of a crime you didn't commit, publicly humiliated in front of your peers, and your entire life was turned upside down? Monique Williams adjusted her crisp black apron, her fingers trembling slightly as she smoothed it over her uniform. At 27, she was no stranger to the grind. By day, she attended classes at Georgia State University, studying social work with dreams of uplifting her community in Atlanta's West End. By night, she served at the Grandview Lounge, a glittering haven for the city's rich and powerful, where every smile she forced hid the exhaustion of working 2 jobs. Her dark eyes sparkled with determination, but beneath her polished exterior, she carried the weight of silent judgments from patrons who saw her as the help, rather than a person with dreams as big as theirs. The Grandview Lounge was a cathedral of opulence. Marble floors, chandeliers dripping with crystal, and a clientele that included CEOs, politicians, and tech moguls. For Monique, it was a battlefield. She'd learned to navigate the passive-aggressive comments, the entitled demands, and the occasional leer from men who thought their wealth gave them permission to cross lines. But she was a professional, her smile a shield, her grace a weapon. She moved through the dining room with the precision of a dancer, balancing trays of champagne and plates of seared foie gras while dodging the subtle slights that came with the job. Tonight, the restaurant buzzed with anticipation. James Morrow, a 52-year-old tech billionaire, had reserved the private dining room for a party of 8. Morrow was a legend in Atlanta, a man whose software empire had reshaped the industry, his name synonymous with power and wealth. His presence at the Grandview was a coup for the restaurant, and the staff was on edge, determined to impress. Monique, assigned to his table, felt the pressure but pushed it down. She'd served men like him before. She could handle this. As she approached Morrow's table, she noted his sharp gray suit, the way his cufflinks caught the light. Gold, intricate, clearly expensive. He barely acknowledged her as she set down a bottle of Chateau Petrus, his eyes fixed on his guests, a mix of investors and socialites, all hanging on his every word. Monique poured the wine with steady hands, her voice soft but clear as she described the evening's specials. Morrow waved her off mid-sentence, his tone dismissive. "Just keep the wine coming," he said, not looking up. She nodded, her jaw tight, and retreated to the kitchen. "Another one of those," she muttered to her friend and co-worker, LaToya, who was prepping desserts. LaToya, a wiry woman with a quick laugh, rolled her eyes. "Rich folks and their attitudes. You good, Mo?" "I'm always good," Monique replied, forcing a grin. But inside, she felt the familiar sting. It wasn't just Morrow's rudeness, it was the way it chipped away at her, night after night. Still, she had no time to dwell. The dining room was filling up, and the night was young. 2 hours later, the mood in the private dining room had shifted. Morrow's party was in high spirits, their laughter echoing as Monique cleared plates and refilled glasses. She moved silently, her presence almost invisible to the group, until Morrow's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Where are they?" he barked, his hand shooting to his cuff. His eyes, cold and piercing, locked onto Monique. "My cufflinks. They're gone." The room fell silent. Monique froze, a stack of plates balanced in her arms. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't." "Don't play dumb," Morrow snapped, standing now, his 6-foot frame looming over her. "They were right here on the table. You were the last one near them." The accusation hit her like a slap. Her heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Morrow, I haven't touched anything of yours. Maybe they fell somewhere." "Fell?" he scoffed, his face reddening. "Those cufflinks are worth more than you make in a year. Don't insult me." The other guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Morrow and Monique. A few whispered to each other, their gazes heavy with suspicion. Monique felt the room closing in, the weight of their stares pressing against her chest. She opened her mouth to protest, but the restaurant manager, Mr. Hargrove, appeared at her side, his face pale. "Monique, step back," Hargrove said, his voice low but firm. He turned to Morrow, all apologies. "Sir, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience. We'll get to the bottom of this." Get to the bottom of it. Morrow roared. She stole them. I want her fired, and I want the police here now. Monique's breath caught. The word stole echoed in her mind, a poison seeping into her veins. She'd spent years building a reputation as honest, reliable, trustworthy. Now, in front of a room full of strangers, that reputation was being torn apart. She glanced at Latoya, who stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock. The other servers avoided her gaze, their silence deafening. Hargrove hesitated, his eyes flickering with doubt, but Morrow's influence was undeniable. "Monique," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need to leave. Now." Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She set the plates down carefully, her hands shaking, and walked out of the dining room, the weight of every stare following her. Outside, in the cool Atlanta night, she leaned against the brick wall, her chest heaving. The police arrived minutes later, their lights flashing, drawing a crowd of curious onlookers. Monique stood alone, her world unraveling, as Morrow's accusations painted her as a thief. The next morning, Monique woke to a flood of notifications on her phone. The story had spread like wildfire. Waitress accused of stealing from tech mogul, screamed the headlines on local news sites. Social media was worse. Anonymous users called her a criminal, a con artist, a thug who'd gotten what she deserved. The comments stung, each one a reminder of the stereotypes she'd fought her whole life to overcome. She sat on the edge of her bed in her small apartment, the walls lined with textbooks and vision boards for her nonprofit. Her dream of helping young black women escape poverty felt farther away than ever. She'd been suspended from the Grandview pending an investigation, and her second job at a local cafe was now at risk as the story gained traction. Her classmates whispered behind her back, and even her professors seemed to look at her differently. "I didn't do it," she told her mother, Denise, over the phone, her voice breaking. Denise, a nurse who'd raised Monique single-handedly, was fierce in her support. "I know you didn't, baby. You're stronger than this. Don't let them break you." But it was hard not to feel broken. Monique avoided mirrors, afraid to see the defeat in her own eyes. She replayed the night in her mind, searching for something she'd missed, some clue to prove her innocence. The cufflinks were real, she'd seen them, gleaming on Morrow's cuffs. But how could they just disappear? And why was Morrow so quick to point the finger at her? Meanwhile, at the Grandview, the staff was divided. Latoya and a few others stood by Monique, texting her words of encouragement, but others distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their jobs. The restaurant's regulars, however, were another story. Among them was Arthur Green, a retired private investigator who'd been coming to the Grandview for years. At 65, with a shock of white hair and a quiet demeanor, Arthur had a knack for noticing details others missed. He'd always liked Monique, her work ethic, her warmth, the way she remembered his order, black coffee, no sugar. When he heard about the accusation, something didn't sit right. "I've seen a lot of liars in my day," Arthur told Latoya over coffee one morning. "Monique ain't one of them. I'm gonna look into this." Arthur Green was no stranger to digging for the truth. He'd spent decades solving cases, from corporate fraud to missing persons, and retirement hadn't dulled his instincts. He started with the basics, the surveillance footage from the Grandview. Hargrove, still shaken by the incident, granted him access, though he warned Arthur not to stir up trouble. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Arthur watched as Monique moved through the dining room, her every action professional, deliberate. He slowed the tape, focusing on Morrow's table. There, around the 2-hour mark, Morrow adjusted his cuff, the gold cufflinks catching the light. A few minutes later, he stood, pacing as he spoke to his guests, his hands animated. Arthur paused the tape, zooming in. The cufflinks were still there. He rewound and watched again, frame by frame. At one point, Morrow reached for his wine glass, his cuff brushing the tablecloth. Something small and shiny fell to the floor, unnoticed by the group. Arthur's heart quickened. He cross-referenced the timestamp with Monique's movements. She was on the other side of the room when the cufflinks fell. Arthur interviewed the busboy who'd cleaned the table after Morrow's party. "Did you see anything on the floor?" he asked. The busboy, a nervous teenager named Carlos, hesitated. I found something under the table. A pair of cufflinks. I gave them to Mr. Hargrove. Arthur's pulse raced. He confronted Hargrove, who admitted to locking the cufflinks in the safe, assuming they'd been misplaced. I didn't connect it to Monique's situation, Hargrove said, guilt in his eyes. Morrow was so sure she took them. Arthur's next stop was Morrow himself. He found the billionaire at his downtown office, a sleek tower of glass and steel. Morrow was dismissive at first, insisting the cufflinks were stolen. But when Arthur presented the footage and Carlos's testimony, Morrow's confidence wavered. His face paled as Arthur laid out the truth. The cufflinks had never been stolen. Morrow had dropped them, and when he couldn't find them, he jumped to conclusions rooted in bias. You saw a young black woman and assumed the worst, Arthur said, his voice steady but sharp. You humiliated her in front of everyone. You owe her more than an apology. Morrow's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Arthur left, knowing the real work was just beginning. The story broke on a local news channel a week later, thanks to Arthur's persistence and a sympathetic reporter who'd been a regular at the Grandview. Billionaire's false accusation ruins Waitress's life, read the headline. The footage of Monique's humiliation went viral, sparking outrage across Atlanta and beyond. Protests gathered outside Morrow's office, with signs reading, "Justice for Monique," and "End Workplace Racism." Monique, who'd been avoiding the spotlight, was stunned by the support. Her phone buzzed with messages from strangers, classmates, and even a few celebrities who'd seen the story. LaToya organized a rally at the Grandview, where regulars and community members demanded Monique's reinstatement. Hargrove, ashamed of his role, offered her job back with a public apology. But Monique wasn't ready to return, not yet. The pain was still raw, the wound too fresh. She met with Arthur at a coffee shop, her eyes tired but resolute. I don't want to just go back, she said. I want this to mean something. I want change. Arthur nodded. Then let's make it happen. James Morrow faced a reckoning. The public backlash was relentless, his company's stock dipping as sponsors and investors distanced themselves. At a press conference, he stood before a sea of cameras, his usual swagger gone. I was wrong, he said, his voice cracking. I accused Monique Williams of something she didn't do, and my actions were rooted in prejudice. I'm sorry. The apology was a start, but Monique wasn't satisfied. She agreed to meet Morrow, but only on her terms. At a community center in the West End, surrounded by her family and supporters, she faced him. An apology isn't enough, she said, her voice steady. You used your power to hurt me, to hurt people who look like me. If you want to make this right, you'll do more than talk. Morrow, chastened, agreed. He pledged $10 million to fund Monique's nonprofit, which she named Rise Up Atlanta, dedicated to empowering young black women through education and job training. He also committed to funding scholarships for underrepresented students at Georgia State and launching a corporate diversity program to address bias in his company. Monique didn't forgive Morrow for his sake, she did it for herself, reclaiming her power. She used the platform to speak out, appearing on talk shows and writing op-eds about workplace injustice. Her story resonated, inspiring others to share their experiences of racism and discrimination. Rise Up Atlanta grew, opening its first center within a year, offering mentorship, skills training, and hope to hundreds of young women. Monique stood on the steps of Rise Up Atlanta's new headquarters, the ribbon-cutting ceremony drawing a crowd of supporters, reporters, and community members. At 28, she was no longer just a waitress or a student. She was a leader, a voice for those who'd been silenced. The Grandview Lounge had faded into the background, a chapter in a larger story. She'd returned briefly, but only to train new staff on cultural sensitivity, ensuring no one else would face what she had. James Morrow, still grappling with his own reckoning, attended the ceremony, standing quietly at the back. He'd kept his promises, but Monique knew his work, and hers, was far from done. The cufflinks, now returned to him, sat in a drawer, a reminder of the cost of prejudice. As Monique cut the ribbon, the crowd erupted in cheers. She looked out at the faces, young women who saw themselves in her, families who believed in her vision, and strangers who'd been touched by her story. She thought of her mother, who'd taught her to stand tall, and Arthur, who'd fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself. "This isn't just about me," she said into the microphone, her voice clear and strong. "This is about all of us. It's about fighting for what's right, no matter who's against you. It's about building something better." The applause washed over her, and for the first time in months, Monique felt whole. Her story had sparked a movement, one that would ripple far beyond Atlanta, proving that even in the face of injustice, resilience and truth could change the world.